Hi, good evening. I'm Rogers Brubaker. I'm a professor of sociology here at UCLA, and I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's event. The event is sponsored by the UCLA chapter of Heterodox Academy, an organization that seeks to promote open inquiry and viewpoint diversity on campuses, and which also seeks to create spaces for the civil, respectful discussion of controversial issues. Youth gender medicine is one such controversial issue. The controversy concerns the protocols that govern the use of puberty blockers, gender-affirming sex hormones, and, more rarely, surgery to treat gender dysphoria in minors. Such treatments have clearly brought relief to many young people, but we know little about their long-term efficacy and health effects. As the numbers of children and adolescents presenting themselves at gender clinics have sharply increased in recent years, and as the profile of those seeking treatment has changed, some clinicians have argued for a more cautious approach to medical interventions that may be irreversible. They acknowledge that these interventions are extremely beneficial to some, but they are concerned that these treatments may not always be appropriate for others. On the other hand, many trans advocates have seen this call for caution as a return to the bad old days of medical gatekeeping. In the meantime, numerous American red states have adopted or proposed draconian restrictions on access to gender-affirming care for minors. These legislative initiatives have been framed using language that sometimes seems to invalidate transgender experience or to dehumanize trans and gender nonconforming people. So in this highly charged context, where there is little space, it seems, for civil discussion of complex and fraught issues, we are delighted to bring to campus the journalist Jesse Singal to speak on this subject. Jesse's 2018 cover story for The Atlantic was one of the first major journalistic accounts of the debate over the affirmative approach to youth gender transition and medicine. While not shying away from controversy, Jesse's extensive work on the subject has shown that it is possible to address a heatedly contested public issue in a nuanced and subtle manner that recognizes the complexities of the issue and respects the diversity of perspectives brought to bear on it. So we thought Jesse would be an ideal speaker for this, which is our first inaugural event. Jesse is the author of the 2021 book, The Quick Fix: Why Fad Psychology Can't Cure Our Social Ills. He's the co-host of the delightful podcast, Blocked and Reported, and he's the author of the excellent Substack newsletter, Single Minded. His work is remarkably wide-ranging, but what's even more remarkable and especially valuable at this hyper-polarized moment is his commitment to exploring and foregrounding the complexities of the issues he addresses. I think Jesse is one of the most consistently interesting journalists of his generation, and I'm delighted to have him here this evening. So here's our plan for the evening. Jesse's going to speak for about 35 minutes. Then he and I will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about half an hour for questions from the audience. We'll end at 6:30. So please join me in welcoming Jesse Singal, whose talk is entitled "Towards a Saner, More Humane Discussion of the Youth Gender Medicine Controversy."
Can everyone hear me? All right, thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm getting over a non-COVID cold, so my voice sounds even worse than usual. I apologize for that. But yeah, thank you guys for coming. I definitely want to thank the new UCLA chapter of Heterodox Academy for having me, particularly Rogers Brubaker and Rick Sander. Heterodox has had a pretty big impact on me as a journalist, even though I'm not an academic. I've met some wonderful people through it. I think it's made a lot of people feel, less alone in ideologically homogenous spaces. It's a really valuable organization. I'd encourage anyone here from the UCLA community to get involved, or if you're coming from elsewhere, start one or get involved wherever you are. Okay, so in theory, this talk is about how to turn the temperature down a few notches on the very toxic youth gender medicine debate. It might not seem that way at first because I'm going to be pretty critical of some people, but by the end, I'll explain how this all ties together into a strategy for reining in some of the most toxic excesses of this conversation. I'm going to presume some basic knowledge on your guys' parts, and I'm not going to define every term, but I'll start by providing a pretty abridged rundown of where we're at in the United States right now and how the controversy arose. So youth gender medicine, meaning puberty blockers, hormones, and then sometimes surgery for minors. And I mean top surgery because bottom surgery for minors is very rare, even though some people say otherwise. This was basically introduced in the United States in Boston in 2007 when Boston Children's Hospital opened a clinic called the Gender Multi-Specialty Service, or GEMS. They hired a psychologist named Laura Edwards-Leeper to work part-time at the clinic, and she flew over to Amsterdam to learn the so-called Dutch protocol developed over there. That's where kids were first put on puberty blockers for these purposes. The basic idea the Dutch came up with was that kids who were really gender dysphoric from a young age, from childhood, and unwaveringly so, and who didn't have major other mental health issues and who had parental support, these were the kids who the Dutch clinicians thought should have access to puberty blockers and hormones. They could start taking blockers at age 12. They could start taking hormones at age 16, although I don't think these age guidelines were followed religiously. The theory the Dutch were operating under was that they could reasonably predict, not perfectly, but reasonably, that kids in this category weren't going to suddenly realize they were cisgender. These were the kids who were going to be trans. That was going to be their adult identity. So the thinking is, why force them to go through a puberty that will cause them a lot of anguish? And why force them into a situation where they might have to get surgery later on they wouldn't have to get if you block their puberty? Excuse me. At the time Laura Edwards-Leeper was setting up the Boston clinic, the Dutch had some preliminary data which seemed to support their approach. They then published 2 seminal studies in the 2010s, the second of which followed up with their clients as young adults after they'd undergone the full suite of medical options, so puberty blockers, hormones, and surgery. That study seemed to find that in many ways their patients resembled their cisgender peers in the Netherlands in terms of psychosocial function. They were just as happy, just as well-adjusted. They were happy, healthy, young trans adults. Okay, but back to 2007 at GEMS, this new clinic in Boston. As Laura Edwards-Leeper would later tell me, she's the one psychologist tasked with developing this protocol there, and she quickly realized that she couldn't actually adapt the Dutch protocol. The Dutch protocol was premised on a lot of careful individualized assessment. You're talking about a year or so. It varied from case to case, working closely with a kid, talking to them about their gender issues to gain enough confidence that they should go on puberty blockers and hormones. Laura Edwards-Leeper realized that she couldn't do that in Boston in quite the same way for a number of reasons. For one thing, when the clinic was founded, she worked just 4 hours a week at this clinic. She was essentially responsible for any kid anywhere in the country who was seeking medical transition. This was admittedly not a huge number at the time, but each case was very resource intensive, and there certainly wasn't time for Dutch-style careful assessment. It also won't shock anyone in this room to find out that the American healthcare system is different in certain ways from the healthcare system they have in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, this stuff was all covered. Anything these kids needed was covered. Laura Edwards-Leeper quickly found that it was hard to get insurers to cover things like puberty blockers. It also was and is hard to get psychotherapy, especially specialist psychotherapy. So as she told it to me, Laura Edwards-Leeper knew that she'd had to have to adapt and sort of compress the Dutch protocol in certain ways. Her clinic wouldn't be able to simply carbon copy it to an American context. So this protocol, which is stereotypically associated with a lot of careful assessment and psychotherapy and an individualized approach, all geared at making sure that a kid is a good candidate for these serious medical treatments, that never really got off the ground in the United States. That's problematic because if the theory is that the Dutch produce data showing that this approach works and that kids who go through it do well, if you deviate much from that protocol, you can't then apply their data to a different system. It's difficult enough to generalize from a subset of Dutch kids to a subset of American kids for cultural reasons of cultural differences, but if you're doing an entirely different protocol, it sort of becomes apples to giraffes. You're assuming you can apply the same logic to a situation occurring in a different time, a different place, and a different protocol for determining who should go on blockers or hormones. So that was Boston starting in 2007. That's effectively how youth gender medicine arrived on our shores. Over the next decade and a half, there were explosions in both supply and demand. As Emily Bazelon reported in an excellent and unfairly maligned New York Times Magazine article last year, today there are, quote, more than 60 comprehensive gender clinics in the United States, along with countless therapists and doctors in private practice who are also seeing young patients with gender identity issues, end quote. It's hard to get good information on exactly how these clinics work and what their protocols are, but it doesn't really appear that they hew all that closely to the careful, in theory, Dutch protocol. Not long after Bazelon's article came out, an investigative team from Reuters reported that it had contacted 18 of these gender clinics and found that, quote, none described anything like the months-long assessments, end quote, that characterized the Dutch approach. A number of these clinics were comfortable putting kids on blockers or hormones on the very first visit as long as certain criteria were met. The difference between the Dutch and American approaches can partly explain why there's so much controversy here. There's little evidence to suggest that it's widespread practice here to proceed as cautiously as the Dutch supposedly did. I say supposedly because the Oxford sociologist Michael Biggs has argued that if you look closely, they didn't actually follow their own protocol that carefully at all times. He's done some really good, interesting work folks should read if they want to be nerds about this stuff like I am. So I think, in addition to what I've already said, two factors have really fueled this debate in the US. Three, if you count Republican efforts to ban these treatments, which have had a profoundly incendiary effect, but I'm going to stick to the scientific debate rather than the political one, to the extent those two can even really be separated. One factor is that actually, Rick, could I get just the water? I forgot to bring it up. I'm sorry. I'm being a huge diva here. A milkshake would be great too, if possible. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so one of these two factors is that since 2020, some European countries have started conducting careful, systematic reviews of the evidence for youth gender medicine. And they all found that the evidence base, and this will be the one time I dip into sort of medical technical language not all of you might understand, they've all found the evidence base sucks. Unfortunately, that includes the Dutch studies. These are weak studies by modern methodological standards for reasons I can get into during the Q&A. But you don't have to take my word for it. Again, you can instead take the words of basically every European public health authority that has looked into this subject deeply. Because of these evidence reviews and because of scandals in places like England and Sweden where it seems like some kids were harmed by really subpar care and the arguably promiscuous administration of these treatments, these countries, as well as Norway and Finland, have all scaled back access to youth gender medicine considerably. They haven't banned these treatments like some US states have or are seeking to do, but they have decided in a pretty serious way that these treatments should be doled out cautiously and in some cases only in research settings. If you want to better understand these controversies across the pond, I'd highly recommend two pieces of journalism. Hannah Barnes wrote a book called Time to Think, the inside story of the collapse of the Tavistock's gender service for children that concerns England. There was also a public television documentary in Sweden called The Trans Train. It was the work of an investigative team led by a journalist named Carolina Gemsby. I've interviewed both of them if you're more curious about their work, and you can also Google that journalism. There was also apparently a Dutch documentary just released about the youth gender medicine system there. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm eager to. The other major factor fueling this controversy in the States is the shift in who is showing up at gender clinics. So generally speaking, you're just seeing a lot more referrals in general. They're also disproportionately natal females. Some clinics report that 70% or even more of the kids showing up at their clinics are natal females, and no one really knows why. You're also seeing kids who didn't have childhood histories of gender dysphoria, or at least none that their parents could detect. That would right off the bat, that would have disqualified them from the Dutch approach, which was premised on the idea that these are kids who have been gender dysphoric for years as children. We don't expect that to change. Again, you don't have to trust me on this stuff. Writing in Pediatrics, the journal Pediatrics in 2020, Anna Lou de Vries, who's a leading Dutch clinician and a co-author of some of the key research that everyone points to as evidence these treatments work, she wrote that the new, different cohort of kids showing up at clinics, quote, raises the question whether the positive outcomes of early medical interventions also apply to, end quote, that group. So she's saying we don't know if you can take our research and apply it to settings like America. Some youth gender clinicians are also seeing more complicated cases today than they used to. So these aren't kids who just have gender dysphoria and then maybe some other minor psychological issues potentially caused by that gender dysphoria. These are kids with OCD or a history of sexual trauma or other serious mental health problems. And when a kid not only has questions about their gender, but a bunch of other mental health issues, it gives rise to the risk of a phenomenon called diagnostic overshadowing. This came up in the highly respected British pediatrician Hilary Cass's report on the Tavistock, which was the biggest and most important youth gender clinic in the world at one point in London. She basically found that diagnostic overshadowing sometimes occurred there. Basically, clinicians sitting with a kid who had 5 mental health problems and questions about their gender would focus in on the gender and push them toward transition while not treating those other comorbidities. And if you read... I'm ad-libbing slightly here, but if you read the history of youth gender therapy, there was this brief period between like actually reparative approaches where they tried to get kids to not be trans or gay and youth gender medicine when the focus really was on this neutral approach. We don't know where this kid is going to end up, but we're going to treat their other psychological problems. Some youth gender clinicians would explicitly say we're not going to focus that much on gender if they also have depression and anxiety. And they found that when you treat depression and anxiety over time, the kid does better. Sometimes the gender dysphoria goes away, sometimes it doesn't. But the point is that treating that other stuff was always a major focus, and in some youth gender clinics now, that's not the case. So yeah, in light of all this, there are roughly 2 camps, to oversimplifying a bit. I mean, Rogers basically explained what's going on. There are people who think that we should ban all these treatments. There's even more draconian stuff, such as Texas, which I don't think it really worked. Luckily, they were basically trying to take trans kids out of their parents' homes, which is grotesque. And then there's other folks who think that like the rise in referrals is just kids getting the medicine they need, and that the reduction in stigma can help explain that. So that's sort of the basic landscape, and it's obviously extremely heated right now. I've been criticized quite harshly for writing and speaking about this the way I do, which is, from my point of view, which is somewhat biased. I feel like I treat it the way I treat any of the other scientific controversies I've written about, including in my book. But in some liberal circles, it's very difficult to talk about this and to treat it as a scientific controversy. I will say I've also gotten plenty of outrage, mostly more from emails for some reason than on Twitter, from people who can't believe that I'm not more opposed to these treatments or are furious that I use preferred pronouns and on and on and on. I do want to make one point about empathy and compassion and other touchy-feely stuff. I really vehemently reject the idea that you need to be trans or gender nonconforming to participate in this conversation. For all the same reasons, I don't think you need to be black to write about or study racial inequality. I don't think you need to be Israeli or Palestinian or Jewish or Muslim to write about or study that conflict. There's unfortunately been a lurch toward a very crude form of identitarianism in some liberal intellectual circles, and I just don't think this viewpoint deserves much respect. I think it's profoundly anti-intellectual. We need to judge people on the basis of their ideas, not their identity, partly because when you say listen to X, no one who says listen to people, black people, or listen to trans people, they don't mean that. They mean listen to the subset of that group who believes what I believe. I've never encountered, like no one, I don't know how many of you know Coleman Hughes, but he's like a centrist, center-right, young black thinker. No one on Twitter who's liberal or lefty and says listen to black people means Coleman Hughes. So I don't take that seriously, and I sort of wish people would explain more what they mean when they say listen to people from this group. Groups disagree about a lot of stuff. They should, they're big. That being said, I do think there's sometimes a failure to recognize that part of the reason this debate is so heated and toxic is that people really feel their lives and identities are at stake. There's obviously widespread concern that kids will be denied medical treatment that some people view as life-saving. There are concerns about youth suicide. And perhaps most important, sort of looming over this whole debate, there are many trans adults who have frankly had difficult lives and rather terrible run-ins with doctors and the mental health establishment. So from their point of view, gaining access to hormones and surgery was life-saving, but they had to fight tooth and nail against a skeptical medical establishment to get there. So I do think part of the reason for the extremely heated reaction to conversations about youth gender medicine is that there are adult trans people who are genuinely alarmed and horrified about the prospect of another generation going through what they went through. It's very humane for them to not want that to happen. I happen to think that in certain ways that's not an accurate parallel, but that doesn't mean we can discount the sentiment or that we should ignore the very raw feelings motivating some of these responses. I just think a fair amount of compassion and empathy and humility are in order, and those have obviously tended to be lacking. So yeah, there's a lot going on now in this space. There are a lot of attempts to ban youth gender medicine, more draconian responses than that. There's a climate of fear and uncertainty, and I think as humans we should accept that when there's a climate of fear and uncertainty, it can be hard to have open and productive discussions. Just a few words just about the role of social conservatives in all this. One argument you'll hear a lot is that you shouldn't talk about problems with the evidence for youth gender medicine because conservatives might weaponize that to pursue their own agenda and legislation. This is another argument I just don't really respect. The argument that we can't discuss X because people we don't like might use X to make arguments we disagree with just doesn't really work if you play it out. There are so many examples of why it doesn't work that I feel like I shouldn't need to run through them, but like if I criticize Israel's treatment of Palestinians, do you know who also criticizes Israel? Nazis. Does that mean we can't, no one here thinks you can't criticize Israel because Nazis also criticize Israel. Or if I criticize the federal government, you know who else criticizes the federal government? Far-right militias. This doesn't work. You're not giving aid and comfort to a group just because you make an argument that happens to align with what some of them say in some circumstances. I also don't think it's journalists' job to only report things that are convenient for one political faction or another. It's just not. Obviously, there's no such thing as pure neutrality or pure objectivity. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when there appears to be a controversy, we should look into it. And if there's an actual controversy there, we should report on the details of that controversy. There won't always be a controversy. If you look into the quote-unquote debate between young Earth creationists and evolutionists, you will find that there isn't actually a debate there. In that case, if as a journalist you treated the question of whether the Earth was created 5,000 years ago as a 50-50 proposition, you would be doing your job poorly. But you'd be doing your job poorly not because you'd be giving aid and comfort to Republican evangelicals, but because you'd be badly misstating the scientific consensus. In the case of youth gender medicine, I had originally written there isn't a genuine scientific consensus. That's not really true because in Europe there is a scientific consensus that we don't have data to support these treatments yet. At the very least, there is a huge controversy between American health and mental health organizations and what's going on in Europe. And as a journalist, you need to be able to report on that. That being said, I do think journalists covering this as a controversy need to recognize the fact that it has become a very potent culture war tool for the right. I'm not saying that every conservative who professes concern about this issue is lying or acting in bad faith, and in fact, some of them have made valuable contributions by critiquing weak arguments and studies produced by advocates for these treatments. Lior Sapir does stuff for the Manhattan Institute. I disagree with him about a lot of stuff. I also think he's an honest guy, and he makes fair points. So I don't know. I'm not going to discount the contributions someone like him makes just because of political differences on other subjects. But there is a subset of influential conservative demagogues and politicians who have been salivating at the red meat that this provides. I think partly it's like there was a group of folks who lost gay marriage very badly, and this is another issue that sort of brings back that strand of social conservatism, frankly. These are figures who are not in this to get to the bottom of the scientific controversy or to figure out how to best help trans and gender nonconforming kids. They're in this controversy because they despise liberals or they're genuinely uncomfortable with certain forms of what I think we would view as societal progress, or because they simply sense political opportunity. So if you're going to write about and discuss this issue, I just think you need to acknowledge the presence of some folks who have different agendas and who are exacerbating the tension and the toxicity with those agendas. That's how you get events like the bomb threat at Boston Children's Hospital, events which are terrifying and corrosive in their own right, but also make it much more difficult to frankly discuss the problems in this area of medicine. So when trans people say that there are folks making really disturbing arguments that seek to undermine and dehumanize them, they're absolutely right. Those of us who feel some degree of skepticism or hesitancy about youth gender medicine should acknowledge this and make it clear that that's not who we are. It should be completely possible to critically evaluate the science here while respecting people who are trans. That should not be a challenge. The point only becomes more obvious when you realize that some of the leading critics of these medicines, or at least folks who have raised important points about the shortcomings in the data, are themselves trans. Among them, Erica Anderson. She's a trans woman and the former head of the United States Professional Association for Transgender Health. Marcy Bowers, who backtracked a little but made an important point about some of the unknowns with youth gender medicine. So there isn't perfect agreement among trans people themselves about these treatments. Okay, what I really want to focus on during the last part of my talk is what I view as the crisis of scientific integrity and transparency within American youth gender medicine research. Because it is a crisis. I can't say this crisis is unique to this particular area. That would be a better story, a more compelling story, if the rest of science was working great, but this one area had been corrupted. But I wrote a whole book called The Quick Fix on similar problems in psychology, and Ben Goldacre has written some, to be honest, much better books on these problems in medical research, Bad Science and Bad Pharma, both of which I recommend. But unique or not, what I've found when I've looked deeply into recently published American studies on youth gender medicine has really disturbed me. I think it's one thing to overhype a study about some dumb, low-stakes intervention along the lines of research shows if you picture Einstein before a big test, that'll make you smarter. Those claims are silly and inaccurate, but they're unlikely to really do much harm. But we're talking about something very different here. We're talking about young people and suicide and permanent medical treatments and mental health. If you exaggerate research along these lines, you're committing what I view as a major ethical breach. And I'm increasingly convinced that that's what a lot of the authors of recent American youth gender medicine studies are doing, as well as the journalists and activists credulously disseminating their findings. This is something I'm happy to talk about in more depth during the Q&A period. I've also written detailed critiques of the studies. They're way too long on my newsletter. But let me just give two quick examples. If it would help, Rogers or Rick could send a list of other links later on for more information. In 2021, a team led by Diana Tordoff and other researchers, mostly at the University of Washington and Seattle Children's Hospital, published a study in JAMA Network Open, that's the Journal of the American Medical Association, about a cohort of kids who went through the youth gender clinic there. The title of the press release was "Gender Affirming Care Dramatically Reduces Depression for Transgender Teens, Study Finds." The idea was that a year after showing up at this gender clinic, receipt of blockers and/or hormones was associated with improved outcomes, big improved outcomes, relative to the outcomes of kids in the cohort who didn't receive these treatments. That's not what the study found, not even close. It's an outrageous exaggeration and distortion of the study's findings, and it required a severe act of statistical cherry picking for the researchers to get there. By the end of the study, there were a grand total of 6 kids left in the cohort of kids who didn't receive treatment, out of a total sample of 100 at the beginning of the study. 6. If you only have 6 kids in that group, you can't make any comparisons between them and the bigger group of kids still on treatment, who went on treatment. The University of Washington actually revised some of its publicity language after I reached out, but everyone involved continues to treat this study as evidence supporting youth gender medicine, and it shows up even in sworn declarations, despite the fact that the most straightforward interpretation of the data there is that the kids who went on these treatments didn't improve. You can literally look at a table buried in an appendix. It shows the kids did not get better over time. To me, it's remarkable that these researchers looked at a group of kids who went on blockers and/or hormones, saw these treatments didn't seem to be associated with any upward improvement, and then told us all the opposite. That shouldn't happen. It's incredibly irresponsible. Second study. Earlier this year, the New England Journal of Medicine published the most important study yet from an all-star team of gender clinicians and researchers who have a multi-million-dollar grant from the federal government to spend many years tracking a cohort of kids who went on youth gender medicine. It was led by Diane Chen and included among its other co-authors Diane Ehrensaft and Joanna Olson Kennedy, both of who are very big names in and advocates for youth gender medicine. This was a multi-site study involving some of the top gender clinics in the country. The researchers simply tracked over 2 years various outcomes of the kids who went on hormones. The New England Journal of Medicine noted in the study's abstract that, quote, in this 2-year study involving transgender and non-binary youth, gender-affirming hormones improved appearance, congruence, and psychosocial functioning, end quote. So that's causal language. One of the most important medical journals in the world is saying these treatments improve kids' psychosocial functioning. But if you read the study closely, there's just little evidence to support such an optimistic reading of the study. We know that because the researchers did this thing called a pre-registration. Well before they published the study, they publicly stated what their hypotheses were, what variables they anticipated would go in which direction, and so on. This is good. This promotes transparency and accountability. If there are major differences between a pre-registration and the final study, that's at the very least a red flag, and without a publicly available pre-registration, there'd be no way to know that. The problem in this study is that there were major differences between what Chen and her team's pre-registration contained and what they actually published. If you compare the pre-registration to the final product, you'll find that of the 8 variables they predicted would improve as a result of hormones, gender dysphoria, depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms, self-injury, suicidality, body esteem, and quality of life, 6 of them just disappear between the pre-registration and the study. There's almost no explanation of why they're absent. This is called outcome switching in some quarters, and it's usually a sign that you didn't find what you wanted to find in your initial analysis, so you cherry-picked or went fishing or whatever metaphor you want to use until you found variables that would allow you to report a more favorable result. Because the key hypothesis also changed between the pre-registration and the study, there's also evidence the authors harked or hypothesized after the results are known, which is a surefire way to publish shoddy research. Of the 2 key pre-registered variables this team did report, depression and anxiety, they actually found that while female to male transitioners improved over the 2 years, male to female transitioners didn't. What's striking, what really jumped out at me in this paper is there isn't a moment's pause. There isn't a moment of, maybe these treatments don't work for everyone. Maybe our diagnostic protocol isn't right. Maybe something went wrong. The only explanation they provide is that maybe the kids needed to be on the hormones for longer. The authors here include some of the most enthusiastic promoters of youth gender medicine, and they are not being fully honest and transparent about the results they've produced. On top of that, 2 of the kids in this study killed themselves during this 2-year span. That's 2 out of 315, which is a high rate in terms of completed suicide under any circumstances, but in this study, subjects were specifically excluded if they had acute suicidality going in. These were not kids you would have expected. Again, 2 sounds like a small number. 2 out of 315 in this context, that is a lot of completed suicides. It's horrible. There are other problems with the study too. For one thing, even the improvements the researchers did find tended to be A, small, meaning they were of questionable clinical significance, and B, it's unclear what caused those improvements, given that the researchers didn't control for psychotherapy or psychiatric drugs, which some members of the cohort received along the way. So there's genuinely zero reason to attribute any improvement they noticed to hormones rather than therapy, rather than drugs, or some combination of the 3. I'm not even saying hormones weren't part of it, but there's no way to know if you don't statistically adjust for that. The long and the short of it is that it's a really bad sign the New England Journal of Medicine published this study in this form. Remarkably, there's a line in the study which reads, quote, "The authors vouch for the accuracy and completeness of the data and for the fidelity of the study to the protocol." Anyone who reads this protocol and then the study would know that this is false. They didn't follow the study protocol. And this isn't some predatory journal. This is the New England Journal of Medicine. Okay, I'll leave it at that in terms of critiquing studies. You can read more about these studies as well as others on my newsletter if you're interested. I said I would turn down the temperature or give some advice for how to do that, and then I issued some fairly searing critiques. That seems contradictory. I don't think it is. I think the way to calm things down is to simply insist that we apply the same norms of scientific evidence we do to this debate as we would to any other debate. If research of this quality had been presented as evidence for the efficacy of Alzheimer's treatments or antidepressants, there would have immediately been a spate of articles in most mainstream general interest and science outlets highlighting those deficiencies. And in fact, there has been a recent surge of coverage casting totally appropriate, well-founded doubt on a supposed breakthrough treatment for Alzheimer's. If someone responded to that coverage by saying, well, surely you don't care about Alzheimer's sufferers or their families. If you did, you wouldn't have critiqued this new medication. That person would be laughed out of the room because that's a ridiculous argument. Yet somehow, this ridiculous argument is accepted here. If you criticize youth gender medicine, you must not care about trans kids or you must want them to die or suffer other horrible outcomes. I think the sheer moral force of this argument and the personal and professional consequences of being labeled a transphobe in the liberal settings that produce most journalism and academic research has led to a stalling out of a critical conversation in the United States that should be occurring in journalism and academia. I'm not going to pretend that all is lost or that things haven't improved. I do believe outlets like Reuters and The Times and some others have caught up. Most importantly, by far, Heterodox Academy, of course. But this is still extremely fraught territory, in large part because people fuzz up questions of scientific evidence with questions of identity. You'll hear claims like trans kids know who they are, full stop, or that questions about blockers or hormones constitute attacks on their very sense of self. Laura Edwards-Leeper, fairly early on, encountered an activist strain of thought that even assessing kids thoroughly before putting them on these treatments was somehow a hostile act against them and invalidation of their identity. Again, we should have some compassion and some historical awareness here. I understand where these ideas come from. They spring from a deep well of trauma within some parts of the trans community. But trauma is not a good way to get to the truth or to resolve scientific controversies. The whole point of having a scientific method and adhering to it consistently and strictly is to transcend certain aspects of the human experience that can lead us away from the truth. I'd of course say the exact same thing to conservatives with strong emotions about youth transition. Emotions, whatever their political origin, should not interfere with the scientific process for figuring out whether and under what circumstances youth gender medicine helps kids thrive. In conclusion, in the long run, it obviously doesn't help these kids or trans adults to keep kicking this conversation about the evidence for youth gender medicine down the road, especially as it's going on in Europe. The conversation here is inevitable. It's already starting to go mainstream, and while there are ongoing attempts to punish and ostracize journalists and clinicians who publicly look into this issue, those efforts will fail, because the truth is the truth, and in this case, the truth is straightforward. In the United States, we seem to be flying largely blind when it comes to youth gender medicine. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jesse, for this very lucid account of the youth gender medicine debate and how it might be reframed to make the debate less toxic. So as I said at the outset, what's going to happen now is that I'm going to engage Jesse in conversation for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for your questions.
Grab a pen.
Sorry?
Just
Pen.
a pen, yeah, nice.
You got some paper? Mm-hmm. So you've emphasized in your writing that gender-affirming care has indisputably helped many people suffering from gender dysphoria. You've been clear about your criticism of red state initiatives that seek to ban or severely curtail access to gender-affirming care for minors. So why do you think some progressives and trans advocates see you as fundamentally transphobic?
I think this happens a lot, like whenever emotions run high. I'm reading a little bit about the recovered memory panic, where there was this supposed spate of incest everywhere through recovered memories. And I'm not comparing myself to her. I wish I could compare myself to her. But Elizabeth Loftus, who was a psychologist who blew the whistle on this issue, was told she was anti-feminist, she didn't care about survivors. I just think this is a normal part of the process of any group expanding its rights and its voice, especially like a group that is fairly new to mainstream activism. And there's a huge number of trans activists who do valuable work and who I can have conversations with about this stuff. I think Twitter and social media, which unfortunately dominates the discussion, does not reflect that. But yeah, everyone involved thinks they're saving or protecting kids. And what's a better recipe for toxicity and for accusation than that?
Well, Twitter brings me to my next question. You've been very active on Twitter, though you're taking a short break from it. Or I don't know how short it is. You're taking a break for a while. Now, Twitter is not exactly known for fostering civil discussion of complex issues. And you yourself have commented more than once about what Twitter does to you. Yeah. And how you end up getting drawn into fights that on some level you know you shouldn't get involved in. And you've certainly taken a lot of abuse on Twitter. And many others have likewise observed that Twitter encourages us to enact a version of ourselves that we're not particularly happy with or proud of. So if you don't mind a somewhat personal question, why do you keep coming back?
Yeah, I mean, I figured out a way to do write only so I can still post stuff to it. The whole platform is collapsing thanks to Elon Musk, so it won't be an issue that much longer. I think it's useful for promoting my work. There's also an element of my narcissism, of feeling like I need to respond to unfair things people have said to me about me, which is ridiculous because it's just a waste of time. But fundamentally, it's addictive. Silicon Valley engineers have figured out how to hack into our brains and make us click and look for dopamine hits. And if I could run back the period of my career since I started writing about this stuff, I don't think I'd do that much differently, but absolutely I would do less Twitter engagement. It's just gotten me into so much pointless, needless trouble. I think it's actually affected my mental health. I don't think it has that effect on everyone. My brother, who is in the audience, has sometimes texted me or emailed me and explained why I should leave it. I appreciate that. When you have a family member in any context who's like, I'm worried about you, it's not a good sign. Yeah.
So you argued in your talk that journalists, in effect, betray their calling. You didn't put it quite so starkly.
That was good, I should have.
When they selectively report things that are convenient for their own political positions, and you suggested that similarly, researchers betray their calling when they overhype shaky evidence that supports their own political positions or when they ignore evidence to the contrary. Now, of course, ideals of objectivity in journalism have been strongly challenged in recent years, often in the name of an alternative ideal like moral clarity, and academic ideals of objectivity have also come under sustained criticism. Now, granted that there's no such thing as pure objectivity or pure neutrality, as you say explicitly in your talk, can we nonetheless salvage something important in journalism and in academic research from this besieged ideal of objectivity or neutrality? And if so, how can this best be done given the fairly relentless attacks on the ideal?
Yeah, I mean, so this idea of moral clarity that I think Wesley Lowery coined, and we've talked about it a couple times on the podcast, I've written about it. He insists that I'm misrepresenting it. I've actually been meaning to I want to talk to him on the podcast about it. It'd be interesting. But I don't think he fits in this category. There's a subset of journalists who I just think see themselves as fundamentally activists. So if they cover reproductive rights, it's because they want to use their work to ensure women have access to abortion, which is a worthy cause. I just don't think it's tricky, because there's nothing wrong with going to a state that's enacted draconian anti-choice policies and covering the consequences of it, but there's just certain bright lines you shouldn't cross. I mean, to me, one of them is just skepticism. If you talk to a reproductive rights activist for your story, are you checking what they say, or are you just being a stenographer? Earlier in my career, in my science writing, I was a stenographer. I'd call or email the first, if it was a political science story, first political scientist, and I would, whatever they said went. I wouldn't run it by someone else. And that's not just about being lazy or ignorant or inexperienced or structural reasons, because there's always pressure to produce. But I just think skepticism offers a pretty good guidepost, and that can let us, if you're just skeptical in general and realize everyone has an agenda, that can let us maybe push away some of those more tricky philosophical questions about objectivity that aren't really resolvable, I don't think.
In your comments on what you called the crisis of scientific integrity in youth gender medicine research, you focused on a few high-profile instances of research that has been done. But what about the research that hasn't been done? Are you concerned that the politicization of research in this area may be discouraging researchers from investigating certain questions, or maybe making it more difficult for certain kinds of research to get funding or to get published in prominent outlets? Maybe I can make this question a little more concrete with an example. So you've written critically about a scientific article that claimed to debunk the hypothesis of so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria. Now, so for those who aren't familiar with that term, the hypothesis is that for some kids who develop gender dysphoria during or after puberty, as opposed to those whose gender dysphoria goes way back to early childhood, social influence or social contagion, as it's sometimes called, may play a significant role. Now, this hypothesis is considered transphobic by many people. So would you be concerned that researchers might therefore be scared away from investigating the possible contributions of social influence to late onset gender dysphoria?
Yeah, I mean, this gets back to that question of skepticism and not letting your priors guide you too much. There was a paper retracted about rapid onset gender dysphoria recently, supposedly because of issues with the IRB, with getting permission to use the data. And it would be a great story if I was like, yep, there you go. There's the censoriousness. I don't know. I think there might have actually been problems with that. It was republished in the Journal of Controversial Ideas, one of those. But yeah, on the whole, it's very clear from what gets published that I think there is bias in this area. Like the New England Journal of Medicine one really got to me because you could easily, with that same data, those same results, produce a paper raising major questions about these treatments and whether they work. So what does that tell you? That it's like a Rorschach thing, but based on what I've seen, it would be very hard, and it is very hard, to published data which runs contrary to that hypothesis. But there's obviously a lot of access to behind-the-scenes stuff I don't know.
As you noted in your talk, youth gender medicine has been widely debated in a number of European countries in recent years, and a kind of public health consensus has emerged in some of these countries in favor of a more cautious approach based on the sense that we just don't know enough about the efficacy and long-term effects of these treatments to be prescribing them widely without careful clinical assessment. So why has no such public health consensus emerged here, and why has discussion been more polarized? Now, of course, I'm not saying there's no controversy in Europe. Of course, it's very controversial there, especially, I think, in the UK. But my impression is that debate hasn't been quite as polarized there. So why do you think polarization has been so much starker in the US?
I mean, I just think it's because we are more polarized. I mean, there's obviously like political tumult in Europe. There's a pretty active far right, but they don't have the same, the two-party hyperpolarization I just don't think is occurring in the countries that have scaled back. I mean, I'm obviously not close to an expert on any of them, but we just have a uniquely dysfunctional system in certain ways. We also have a religious right in a way a lot of those countries don't, I think. I mean, they obviously have some religious people, just not like a muscular religious right that's actually involved in politics to the same level. I think that's part of it. It's also just like where we are many countries in one country in terms of the differences between California and Mississippi and Massachusetts and Ohio. And I'm worried that this is headed toward a situation where it's just like dotted blue states, red states with completely different approaches to this question, similar to what happened with abortion.
Let me ask you about a slightly different issue, but one that I think is closely connected to the youth gender medicine controversy. Why do you think that it has become so difficult to talk about sex? And I don't mean sex as in sexual activity, I mean sex as a biological category. It's a fairly recent development. Not that long ago, people were comfortable talking about sex alongside gender, and the distinction between sex and gender used to be central to the way people talked about gender dysphoria. But now, everything seems to collapse into gender, and more specifically into the idea of gender identity. And biological sex is increasingly seen as a problematic or maybe even an illegitimate thing to talk about. Yep. There was a striking recent instance of this. Some of you may have seen this. This was the cancellation last month of a panel, literal cancellation, of a panel on biological sex that had been scheduled as a part of a major anthropology conference. So why has it become so difficult to talk about sex? And does this matter? Is it important for us to be able to talk about sex along with gender?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the direction of like one strain of mainstream trans activism has been that it's very important that everyone is literally who they say they are. And the problem is like, what does that mean? What does it mean to literally be who you say they are? And if you want to get to the point where, yes, everyone is literally who they say they are, the biggest obstacle to that is biological sex. So if, like, my understanding of the issue was, my traditional understanding had been like a trans woman is biologically male, but for numerous reasons of morals and ethics and decency, we should treat them as a woman, except in like certain outlying cases where that might be debatable. But for some, I can't explain it. It's become very important to be like, there's no sense in which they are not a woman. And my somewhat limited reading of sort of like old school transsexuals, what they would, as they called themselves, was like that wasn't quite it. Like there was this understanding, like, no, I'm like sort of this own thing. I transitioned. This is better for me. But I'm just worried about this. I mean, I've talked to researchers who, the most extreme example I've heard was a push in mouse research to not talk about female mice, but instead mice with ovaries. And at a certain point, I guess the other problem here is like there's been zombie statistics that supposedly 2% of the population is not straightforwardly male or female. My understanding is like the actual, it's like 99.5. It depends how you define certain terms. I'm not an expert in this. This was a Anne Fausto Sterling argument that I think got mutated and sort of corrupted, but I don't know. This is also an area where, excuse me, just politically, it bounces right off people. Like, to me, the moral case against bathroom bans. Like, it really is. You're going to prevent people from peeing, like, and I was glad for the backlash in North Carolina, but then you tell people, like, no, also you can't use male and female. You have to use people who menstruate. It just doesn't, I don't think it works. I mean, my area isn't like political messaging. It's just, I think a lot of people are repelled by it, and I'm confused why people have chosen that hill to die on. I wish I had a better answer. I don't.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We're now going to open the floor for questions. We have a little more than half an hour, and I want to give as many people as possible a chance to participate, so I would ask that speakers limit their questions to a maximum of 1 minute. So, floor is open. Please.
You mentioned a period of time when they had a neutral approach. Do you have anybody specific you can mention that was known for that, or a period of time when that was actually happening?
I do. I'm going to butcher his name because it's Italian. Domenico Di Cegle. So Hannah Barnes' book Time to Think has a lot of stuff on that because like it was basically around the turn of the century. So I think the first case study of the Dutch approach puberty blockers was like 97, but it wasn't until like 2005. I'm terrible at dates. 2005ish they really put all that many kids on it. So there was this period where my sense, and I'm sort of looking into some of the issues now, they realized that the reparative approach or the conversion approach had, from their point of view, like failed, and early on they didn't care about the moral dimension of it. And there were awful experiments where they would give kids well, it's a whole thing. Conversion therapy is bad. It's a very controversial stance. But I think there was a period where they realized that hadn't worked, and their best bet was just let these kids figure out who they are, work with them on the gender issues, on the results of the gender issues, on the stuff they were dealing with in school. But Hannah Barnes has a ton of citations on that. Long-winded answer.
Yes.
We are in a law school, so my question is, how do you see the law, of this area developing in hopefully a more kind of constructive way than this sort of, complete polarized, red states, blue states that you mentioned? And what are some possibilities for, I guess a middle path that we should look into?
As a podcaster, I have a right to spout off on stuff I know nothing about. I guess my only observations there are like, gender identity is a really fuzzy concept. Alex Byrne, I can never pronounce it, I'm so bad with names. The philosopher at MIT is good on that. So seeing that written into law, it's just gonna cause issues because it's so poorly defined. I've sometimes wondered, like, gender dysphoria is a very real thing and a very crippling thing, and people with gender dysphoria should be accommodated. I've wondered, I know nothing about this, if maybe part of the way to toward a less polarized approach would be just to acknowledge a difference between people who do and don't have gender dysphoria, because the present understanding of being trans is some trans people don't have it, and to me those are very different categories. From someone who literally can't leave the house in male clothes without feeling horrible or suicidal, which is a very real thing that happens, versus someone whose understanding of their gender identity isn't as based on what is effectively a disability. And then I guess the only other one I know a little bit about is the school stuff. It just seems to me there's probably going to have to be a solution a little bit more nuanced than whatever a 10-year-old tells their teacher and principal about their gender identity goes without the parents being notified. I totally acknowledge there's probably some situations where there's a dangerous home situation, but it's never been clear to me, if you have evidence of that, you're a mandated reporter. Why aren't you involving the police? So I'm not really answering the question, so I'm not sure. I do my best. I'm a podcaster.
Thank you. Yes.
The battle against the extremism we talked about from the right is kind of out in the open because it's mostly in the political arena. But on the left, the extremism within trans activism is sort of behind the scenes more. It's maybe on the boards of these medical journals. It's the American Psychological Association or American Pediatric Association, as it's called. So it's really hard to tell how it's going. Do you have any feeling for is the battle being lost or won, or what? And what tells you?
I mean, I think one of the most important organizations here is the World Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare, and it's absolutely one of the important battle lines is the impact of there's activists, there's clinicians, and there's also clinicians who are also activists. And it's hard, it's complicated. So there was a lot of focus, the focus of Emily Bazelon's article was on the adolescent chapter of the most recent standards of care. If you read it, it actually says kids should be very thoroughly assessed. If you deviate from the Dutch protocol, you're being experimental. There's a lot of good stuff if you have a perspective like mine. But then, because of the activist influence, as soon as they release the standards of care, like a day or two later, they correct it and they remove all age restrictions for all procedures. So to me, that neatly captures how like it's just an ongoing dynamic fight. And there's also a huge fight between basically mental health providers and doctors, like especially endocrinologists, like pediatricians. They like drugs. They like medicine for understandable reasons. They're trained for that. And so a lot of the conflict behind the scenes is between those two camps. Like, how much mental health assessment do we need? Is it that important? The Boston clinic I mentioned was founded by a urologist and an endocrinologist. And I sort of got the sense they brought on Laura Edwards-Leeper as a 4-hour-a-week psychologist. It's like, it almost seemed like an afterthought. So I don't think that has been focused on enough. Yeah. I'll try to make my answers less rambly.
In political science, we study social movements, and you could say that there are an uncountably large number of issues that never turn into a social movement, and the ones that do are almost never successful, and the ones that are successful often takes decades to be successful. And there's one really huge exception, the trans movement. Right? So you have a minority of a minority of a minority, and it has been successful in just a couple of years, you know, in some sense, taking over the healthcare system, taking over journalism, this, that, and so forth. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think it's slightly overstated to say taken over, just because there's a lot of like debate. But I don't know. One theory that my co-host Katie Herzog, this is her theory as a certified lesbian. She has the certificate on her wall and everything. Is that after gay rights became law of the land, there was a need for another issue, like another big issue. And so in that sense, it was sort of a top-down decision to make that the next fight. I don't really have a way of knowing whether or not that's true. It seems true-ish. I also think that like the focus on or obsession with identity in liberal spaces in the last, whatever you want to call it, decade, of carving us into thinner and thinner categories along racial lines, sexual orientation, gender identity. You mix that with social media, and just this idea that you get to be whoever you want becomes really important. And almost overnight, just some norms have shifted along those lines. Like this idea that you get to determine it, no one else can question it. And I can't explain how it's happened so quickly, but it's happened so quickly. And then also just like, if you're in a newsroom, I can't emphasize this enough, if you're in a newsroom or like an academic department and there's one person, there's a political science concept of preference intensity. If you have 100, everyone in this room, if 99 of you were neutral on gun rights, but one was a gun nut, that person would have undue influence because they care more. So in a lot of situations, I think there's a small group of activists, and I've heard numerous stories about this, who care a lot and change the whole tenor or direction of an organization because a lot of people are like, okay, whatever, like why bother fighting with it? Yeah.
Let me just follow up on Susanna's question by asking, how important do you think in this context, and explaining, as it were, the anomalous success of the movement, how important was it that the movement succeeded in framing itself as the as the frontier of civil rights struggles?
Yeah, I mean, very important because, you know, my generation has seen, it was also astonishing, like the progress in gay rights. I mean, just from when I was a kid, that was one of the events that I sort of cut my teeth on as a writer, was gay marriage. Like, it was a huge fight. There was talk of constitutional amendments banning gay marriage, which is unthinkable now. So I think the way some trans activists have wisely presented this as sort of the sequel to that, right down to the sort of Born This Way framework. And there was just a really good radio lab from a trans woman at one of the Massachusetts liberal arts schools who wrote a book on the history of Born This Way as both like an idea and a political tactic. I really want to read the book, but Born This Way makes a lot of sense politically. Applying Born This Way to a 13-year-old who has just come out of as trans and has a lot of other stuff going on might be a little bit fraught.
Yes.
I miss you on Twitter, Jesse, so I think you should come back.
You're an enabler.
You should definitely come back. As a sort of a generalized question about science, besides pre-registration, what are the things that would make research better and that people could look towards or that you would say would help?
Yeah, I mean, some of this goes to areas where like I need to call up or email statisticians for help, but there's just all sorts of like subtle ways you can fudge your findings, p-hacking, stuff like that, to generate bad results. The reason I focus on pre-registration is I think it solves a lot of problems in one package, because if you're very clearly like, this is what we're studying, these are the statistical tools we're using, here's what we expect to find, you're putting such guardrails on it. Press releases are horrible. University press offices should not be able to basically lie about what studies found. I also think there should be far more incentives to publicize null results. Like if you don't find something, that should be just as publishable. There's also the, I forget what it's called. It's basically a system where a journal accepts a study I wrote about this in my book, based solely on the proposed methodology, regardless of what they find. We will publish whatever you find. I think that would be great. So I think there's been some progress, but it's crazy still what gets published.
Yes.
What do you think the future holds on this topic? Where do you think it's going? I mean, we see what's happening in Europe, Finland, Holland, UK. We're treating it very differently here.
Yeah.
Is it going to keep going in that kind of activist direction, very polarized? Some would say disregard of the science and research.
Yeah.
Or do you think it might track due to the pressure of what's happening over in Europe to a more centrist approach?
Yeah, I mean, I could see it veering off in that sort of bifurcated way. I think one thing that might prevent that is the most all-American thing of all, which is lawsuits. I just read a lawsuit, this guy who basically wrote the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement is named in this lawsuit, and it's really bad. I only read the complaint. That's like, their version of it. There could be extenuating factors. There could be another explanation, but yeah, it suggests like incredibly irresponsible care for a really disturbed young person who is institutionalized, and they ignored all these other problems and transitioned her. She's now back to her. So the way media and focus and attention works, it won't really, I think it won't really matter how often that occurs. And this is at the risk of going too far in the other direction, like of overcorrecting to I forget which number of correction we're on. But it'll only take 2 or 3 of these really high-profile detransitioner cases and lawsuits, both to put a focus on that issue. And I don't really know how the medical profession works in terms of liability, but that will obviously become a bigger issue. So I think that might slow down some of the excesses. I just don't know exactly how it's going to play out. I do know the lawsuit seemed really bad.
Yes.
Yeah, I really appreciate this presentation, and I'm eager now to maybe turn the conversation back to journalists, what they can do. So, I think you make solid observations about the effect of identitarian thinking on academia generally and science in particular. But, I see that effect really in your approach as well, insofar as, you've gestured, that focusing on trans activism and trans communities, this is important. I mean, we often talk, though, not even about trans activism in isolation, but LGBTQ, and I think that's a really important context. You signaled a little bit about, maybe there's something about this pivot after same-sex marriage to the trans issue, but, I feel like feminism and the women's movement is really a contextual source, that there's an identitarianism in the media keeping this really separate from the LGBTQ. So, here we are, and we're talking about the unspeakability of the body, and, what happened after same-sex marriage is not only trans rights being jeopardized, but reproductive rights. And I think that this might inform your story to have a bit more of your chronicle in terms of a broader vision of the forces at play. Certainly, the conservative side sees women, sexuality, gender identity issues, but these investigations on the media continue to barricade.
I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. So you're saying what role of feminism in this exactly?
I am saying that I think that your presentation around this issue as thinking about gender affirming care and the trajectory of this movement and the reactions on all sides should really needs to be a story that's always tracking what's happening around issues of women's rights.
Yeah.
Feminism, reproductive rights. I think, for example, your slippage between talking about, in response to Robert's question, why is gender identity pushing away our ability to talk about sex? And then your response is, why are we talking about mice with ovaries that's actually instead of female mice?
Yeah.
That's not a question about gender identity. That's a language shift that really comes out of a different but aligned decades-long history of feminist interrogation.
Yeah.
So I think many of the conundra with which you ended your conversation with Rogers might fruitfully be resolved by taking the advice that I totally agree with you that you're giving and not let this identitarian thinking encroach on your own framing of these issues.
Yeah.
We're talking about gender, youth, and care. We want to think gender in a sort of broader history than the particular focus that you're giving.
That's fair. There's a book that had a big impact on me, and I feel horrible because I'm forgetting the author's name, called Age of Fracture. And he talks a little bit about that movement, I guess, which started in the 70s. Like, the first people to be like, what is a woman, were, I think, among them, like, some feminist scholars who really, like, started to deconstruct. Well, yeah, sorry, yes. Obviously, yeah. But there was parts of that book that reminded me actually a lot of, like, contemporary discussion of trans issues. So anyway, thank you.
Yes, please.
So regarding how to prevent bad science from being published, some fields I'm scientists, some fields of science have figured out how to do this, to some extent, pretty reasonable extent actually. What they do is they require the authors of the paper to pre-publish their work, so the general community of scientists can read it before it gets to the editors of the journal. And then you get crowdsourced opinion. And
These are preprints, right?
these are preprints, but they're required to be publicly posted on the internet on specific sites. Physics is very good at this. And so then you get a crowdsource of all the errors in the paper, and the authors are actually embarrassed to continue the editorial process until they fix some of those errors. And
Yeah.
the editors are embarrassed to publish a paper that's been criticized to that extent. So it's much more transparent. Sadly, medicine is not one of the fields that has adopted.
Yeah, I found some of the authors of the papers I'm talking about, I don't know, they seem a little bit immune to embarrassment. Or, I mean, it could literally just be, I'm just some Substacker, or I have a reputation, but they won't generally, the points I've written about and other people have written about are not minor points. If you disappear 6 of your 8 variables, that's not a minor point, and they still haven't responded to that. I think a lot of them feel like there's like a siege mentality because there are these attempts to ban their work. But yeah, the preprint thing I think has some promise. I'm just not sure here. I don't know. It could work. It's just been interesting to me watching how little they respond to critiques and how unwilling they are to answer basic questions about their research. And I just think the journals themselves need to play that gatekeeping role because, yeah.
Well, so I've been the editor of the scientific journal, and as the editor, you are the final gatekeeper.
Yeah.
And so if you are not responding to this criticism, I mean, you can do that, but you're doing a very poor job, and it becomes public that you're doing a poor job because the criticisms are out there,
Yeah.
and you as the editor do not require them to be there.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
So, when in the moral debate about this, when people are talking about what should we talk about in terms of like trans journalism, there seems to be a calculus between being made by trans activists and people on the other side who they're making a calculus between people who received treatment and were harmed by it versus the people who did not receive treatment and would benefit from it. I think we see conservative policies cause large numbers of people who would benefit from treatment who did not receive it, and liberal policies still may numbers that you can put to it, to like people who receive treatment or are harmed by it?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me this is part of why people are saying you ought not speak about it the way you are.
Yeah, the simple answer to that is we have no idea what the rates at which people are. Well, there's a couple things. One is like how defining harm is tricky. Like, is harm regret? If someone doesn't regret something, but also they've experienced no improvement on objective metrics. So you have to first decide how to define harm. But no, for the American youth gender system, we have no data on basically how we're doing. And there's one of the reasons for that is that clinics are not really producing data. They're hiding some of their data in some cases. We're such laggards compared to, I mean, it's complicated because it has to do with who had gender clinics when. So like Canada, the UK, and the Netherlands have produced disproportionate amounts of data because they had early gender clinics. But yeah, my response to that is just we have no idea. I hear a lot that it's a small number. And I'm not saying it's a huge number. I don't know. It could be big, it could be small, it could be medium. I also don't think we'll know for years. But to me, the time to get a good protocol in place is now, given that I don't think we really know what we're doing.
As a follow-up, then how do you, I mean, I realize you responded to this a lot, but maybe you could address it here as well. How do you address the people who say you ought not talk about this because of that ratio? We believe there are so many more people who are not receiving treatment and would benefit from it than there are people who are receiving treatment who are harmed by it.
Oh, I'm just not convinced by that. I mean, we've seen a huge surge in kids being referred to these clinics, but we don't know why that is. We don't know. The reason this wasn't a controversy in 2008 is because hardly any kids sought this treatment, and a huge number are seeking it now, and they're more complicated cases. So, yeah, I hate to keep giving you "we don't know" as an answer. I just think that's the only honest one.
Well, I am glad that you included in your answer to the first part of the question your famous "it's complicated."
It's complicated.
Line. I was going to be really
Take
disappointed.
a shot.
Really disappointed if we went through the entire without Jesse saying "it's complicated." Yes, please.
I'm curious about your sense of quality and use of statistics around suicide in the trans population.
Yeah.
It was something 5-10 years ago I was quite sympathetic to, but I have no idea. Are they used all statistics or not all statistics? How are they being used?
Yeah, this is a really tough one. So you'll often hear statistics like 40% of trans youth, I think one version is, have attempted to kill themselves in the last year. And this is where people I understand why people get mad when you try to like be a nuance bro on this, but it's actually important. If you ask someone, have you attempted suicide, especially a young person, and you don't ask any follow-up probes about like exactly what they did, you will get an overestimate of the suicide rate. You'll get something like 40%. The CDC found with follow-up probing, you get 40% if you just ask, have you tried to kill yourself? I forget if it was last year or a lifetime. 20% when you like try to suss out if it was a genuine suicide attempt. So that is overstated. There was also a really good presentation at this conference on this stuff a couple weeks ago in New York by the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, notoriously transphobic because they're skeptical of some of this stuff, but they have good people. And the best data we have suggests that if you control for other psychopathologies, like mental health comorbidities, trans kids luckily do not have some super elevated suicide rate. That doesn't mean that it's not a tragedy whenever a young person kills themselves, but I do think there's a myth that these kids are just like hair trigger about to kill themselves constantly. I think that's really harmful, both because it adds an unnecessary level of panic to individual medical decisions, and because there is possibility of a contagion effect there. If you constantly pair in the media lack of access to treatment with suicide, like some of what we know about how suicide works, like that could make the situation more dangerous. I saw that hand shot
Yes.
up. Shoot.
Yeah, well, you actually just got onto what I was going to ask about, which is suicide contagion and what I was talking about. Has anybody studied if like suicide contagion has had an impact specifically on the trans community?
Not that I'm aware of, and I would imagine that would be like a really hard thing to study. I do know like the idea of suicide clusters is pretty well studied, but that's not in trans context.
Yes.
Jesse, you mentioned a couple research implications that you thought were kind of skewing the data a little bit dishonestly. Other than UCLA, are there any schools that you feel like are doing a really good job?
It's not, I don't know. I don't really think of it in those terms. Like it's more journals, at the level of journals, like which journals are doing a good or a bad job. There's a journal called the Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy that I think has like sort of a conservative reputation. They've published some good critiques of the Dutch approach that you just don't see. And one of my problems as like a writer and a journalist is I'm extremely negative, and I think that probably limits my reach. That is why my book didn't sell well. But like journals like Pediatrics have just done so embarrassingly poorly on this, and the stuff they publish, and he's frequently criticized, but the researcher Jack Turbin, who keeps squeezing milk out of this desiccated husk of the 2015 United States Transgender Survey, which is a horrible data set that cannot be used to tell us anything, I don't understand how this stuff continues getting published. So you asked me an uplifting question, and I, as is my wont, I was like, screw everything.
And I'm afraid in his past coverage of UCLA, Jesse hasn't highlighted our most
Michael
shining,
LaCour was
our
my,
most shining moments indeed. The Mike LaCour story, for those who don't know, remember, it was a political science PhD candidate who fabricated his data and so on.
But he was not a transphobe, as far as we know.
Yes, at least. Yes.
I'm wondering how you're navigating all this science. Could you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to someone about this earlier. I got a master's degree that had something of a quant focus. So that taught me the basics, like how to read a regression table. They really taught us how to read basic social science studies, because this program was mostly for people who would go work for the Congressional Budget Office or write policy memos for members of Congress. So they needed to just be able to digest stuff and figure out the basics. But I'm really only good at the basics. And I ask like Gabriel Rossman types for help fairly frequently. But because journalists are like so poorly trained on this, if you had a scale where, I just said this earlier to someone, if like 0 means you don't know any math at all and 10 is a PhD in quant, if you're at like a 2 or a 3 as a journalist, you can run rings around other journalists and you can actually like do a lot of work you couldn't do otherwise. So that's I think where I'm at.
Yes.
I was going to ask you, do you have specific examples? You and Katie have said that you think things are getting better in public about discussing this, in the New York Times
Yeah.
is covering it. And I noticed that Andrew Sullivan also says that every now and then on the podcast, and then I just realized in the last couple of weeks, both of you sort of got off of Twitter. I'm wondering
Right.
dovetail together, like you guys are engaging less, and so maybe you're thinking
Some combination of getting off Twitter, SSRIs, other variables. No, I mean, I think, like to me, the Times is a good example because Azine Qureshi, who's now like the science staffer on this, she does good stuff. I don't agree with everything she writes, but like she clearly views this as a controversy. And they had Megan Twohey of Jeffrey Weinstein fame, Me Too fame. She wrote a big article, or co-authored it, with Christina Jewett on puberty blockers. Reuters has an investigative team on it. In 2020, I was like sort of, felt like one of the only left of center journalists covering this. Now I have competition in the form of, somebody's up with my mic, real journalists, some of whom are more talented than me, unfortunately. So that's why I think it's gotten better. I don't think that means it's gotten better in every institution or every academic department, but journalistically, I have some hope.
Yes. Come on.
Yeah, so in the interest of progress, whether in your talk to clinicians or your own opinion, are there analogous models of 10, 20, 30 years ago where this process of kind of dissensus on therapeutic treatments were a totally different sphere? They combined therapy and pharmacological, biological remedies, ended up in a kind of consensus way of treating a particular condition that now we all agree that that was really great, we made all the progress. Is there a model that's analogous to what's going on now, not the consensus, but what made people, oh, this is what we should try to emulate as a scientific community, therapeutic community, et cetera?
That's interesting. I don't know if I can come up with like a clean example off the top of my head. I mean, the recovered memory stuff keeps popping up in my head because that was a situation with some similarities in terms of, this wasn't exactly what you're asking, this is the best I got. This idea of trusting patients in a very totalizing way. Whatever the patient says goes, you can't push back, you can't explore, and you're actually nudging a patient toward a certain realization. I think it was extremely valuable for everyone to realize how harmful that approach was. And I think there's a subset of gender clinicians, especially the sort of vanguard ones who really come at this from the idea that they're helping like uncover something deep within these kids. And I think some bad stuff is going to come out about how that goes.
Is it surprising though that there's no other model that anyone ever referred to, and you talk to all these people, and they say, well, this is one way that maybe we could do it.
Well, I mean, I think that's partly just like we don't really, psychologists and psychiatrists in general don't really know what they're doing. I mean, like the serotonin theory of depression is up for the debate. Amyloid plaques, and also like there's so much we don't know. I don't think there's that many examples other than like, I guess CBT is pretty good and antidepressants work pretty well. There's just not that many successful models in general. I think maybe experts in this room would disagree with me, but again, I'm a pessimistic guy.
This is a little reminiscent to me of a medical controversy of about 20 years ago, which was bone marrow transplants for breast cancer.
I'm very glad you said that.
Yeah. And there's a really fabulous book called False Hope.
I read it, yeah. Sorry.
Well, so just to follow that through, that got settled with about 300 lawsuits, which were split exactly down the middle.
Yeah.
And it only got resolved when the definitive clinical trial came out and the bone marrow transplant stopped overnight.
Yeah.
So my question is, you put a lot of thought into this. What would a definitive trial look like to you? Granted, you're not the clinician, but you've studied this probably more than anybody else in this room. What would you design as the definitive clinical trial that would answer the question?
Well, first I should ask, if more people have questions, could we go a little over?
3
Sure.
minutes.
Yeah.
How many people still have questions? And you have one. Should we say 10 more minutes? Would that be okay?
Sure. Let's just, well, after this question, we'll just take a
Take whoever's
1 minute
left.
pause, and if people have to leave, they can
Yeah,
leave.
yeah, people are welcome
We'll
to leave.
continue. Yeah.
People, you've been free to leave throughout, by the way. One of my newsletter commenters recommended I read False Hope, and it was fascinating. I'll just give the 1 minute version. It was called high-dose chemotherapy with autologous bone marrow transplant. It was a treatment for women with like otherwise hopeless stage 4 breast cancers. And there was all this excitement. There was early research suggesting it worked. And if you trace the story of this, you saw that it was deployed. It was rolled out well before good evidence was in. And if you were against it, it meant you were a stooge of the insurance companies that didn't want to cover it, or you didn't care about women and their health. So it was a lot of the same politicization of an unresolved scientific question. And it was finally in, I think, 1999, the definitive trials came out. There was one outlying trial from South Africa that showed the treatment worked amazingly. The only problem with it, and it's a subtle, nuanced problem, is that he made up all his data. Other than that, it was a very good trial. As for a trial here, I don't really know. I mean, you hear a lot of people say you can't really do a RCT for ethical reasons, which is false. We do RCTs for life and death treatments all the time in cancer and the COVID vaccine, so that doesn't make sense. The obstacles to a blind RCT are pretty clear because like hormones have physical effects on you. You also need to like put things in context. In today's context, would anyone agree to be in a randomized trial? That was they couldn't do RCTs for that treatment because people didn't want to be randomized. And
But they eventually did.
they eventually did, yeah, but it was hard to get, if memory serves, yeah.
It took years.
Yeah,
But if they had not done that, it would have gone on forever.
absolutely.
This
But
will go on forever.
Right.
Until somebody does a definitive clinical trial.
yes, but if and again, this is not my area, but my understanding is if you're a young person who wants hormones in America, why would you choose to enroll in an RCT where you might get a placebo versus just go get hormones somewhere? So that I think would raise some issues. I don't buy most of the moral arguments against it. I think it's question begging because they say we can't do it because then people would be harmed, which,
But if you put your faith in science,
yeah,
which you sort of have, because your whole presentation is about science,
Yeah.
then science has got to answer it.
yeah,
So it might help your presentation to have some little
sliver of positivity.
what the science might look like at the end of the day.
That's a good point.
That might answer the
Yes, I think
That's a friendly suggestion.
No, that's absolutely right. I do think some randomized trials would be ideal. I also think a lot of clinics have wait lists, and you can leverage that to do studies that aren't perfect or ideal, but get you somewhere. But I mean, the first step is just to convince the top experts that we need to do actual high quality research on this, because they will openly say otherwise.
Great, so Jesse's kindly offered to go on for another 10 minutes or so, but I know some of you may have counted on leaving now, so please feel free, but we will.
Thank you for coming, people have to leave.
We will.
How dare you?
Yes. I know who you are. You'll be held accountable. Great, so we can take a couple more questions. Yes, please.
So I have kind of a follow-up to the RCT discussion stuff. So I mean, my impression is like when you're dealing with like maybe a clinical drug or something, you can reasonably expect that like there's no like personal individual differences among people that will like affect like if they volunteer to participate in the RCT and then versus like mental health outcomes or something. But like in the case of like hormones for youth, obviously since gender identity is such an internal thing, there's probably going to be like huge sample selection bias when it comes to like who volunteers to be in that possibility of getting a placebo. And then, you know, if people feel like they're getting a placebo and they really feel like they need treatment, because a lot of trans people going through puberty, like they feel like my body is like changing in a way I don't like.
Especially for blockers,
Yeah, and so time is like of the essence, and so they will like, if you don't give them treatment, like in the UK they have like really long wait lists and stuff, so many people have to seek out like, you know, black market methods of getting hormones, and so like, it feels to me that it's kind of, even if society agreed that we should run an RCT, like the results from that RCT would still be suspect, not like suspect in like a people did this unethically way, but suspect in like, you know, can we really discount effects of like sample bias and things like this? And so it just seems like to me that it's very difficult to study. And then you mentioned a couple times like, you know, those studies I'm not going to defend because I think they're bad for reasons you pointed out. But like findings like there was no improvement in the mental health even after being on hormones. But it occurs to me like a potential possibility, especially for youth who might feel like time is of the essence and stuff, is their mental health is declining. And so rather than an improvement in their mental health, it might be like we've stopped the decline of their mental health. Right? And you know, in my own personal experience, very much it hasn't been like my life is amazing. It's been like my life has stopped getting worse at like an extremely high rate, right? And so like it's like slowed down the rate of depression rather than curing the depression. And so like it feels like you can't really tell whether we need that control group, right? Except for many reasons, like the control group is always going to be imperfect. For ethical reasons, it's difficult to run that study, and for sampling reasons, like the results would be difficult to interpret even if we had perfect data. And so I'm just like wondering if you have thoughts, because it really to me it seems like all these claims about how we don't have data, my just intuition is like we'll never have good data. Like there's always going to be like a touch and feel, like we're going to have to like go based on like anecdotal evidence.
No, I think those are all fair points. And so in the case of the University of Washington one, like I was drawn to that in part because of how they advertise it. They advertise it as like tremendous improvement. If they'd said from the start, we think, you can't say anything from that study. If they'd said basically the kids who went on hormones appear to have stayed stable, I'd have no major gripes from a science communication perspective. On all the other, just the difficulties of running good studies, I mean, I'm basically just with you and don't really know the answer. The other thing is, like in a lot of settings, you're going to get sort of like, I think just the most desperate people willing to enroll in RCTs because they won't be people who have access to those treatments otherwise. I'm open to the idea, like especially with blockers, I'm open to the idea that it was considered a failed replication of the Dutch research when Tavistock found that those kids didn't improve, except in like a subjective self-report measure. For blockers, I'm very much open to the argument that like if you just stay the same while trying to figure out what to do, that's an okay outcome. For hormones, I think if you're going to go with that argument, I just think activists and clinicians need to really reframe what they're claiming, because they have been claiming, and there's anecdotal reports of some people do thrive after going on them, but yeah, I hate to have so few like positive contributions to make, but like everything you're saying is true. It's just like really difficult to study this well. I just think in the meantime, overstating the weak studies we have does do harm.
Yes, please.
Just maybe to bounce off that, because you made a really good point that the whole gender identity is internally, you know, it's very focused on internal interpretation. But does that mean that RCTs aren't available? So I'm just going to offer up that I'm married to someone who has neuroelectrostimulators in her brain. It was a 15-hour brain surgery. But however, it was for depression. So the whole depression thing with psychiatrists and all that is metaphorical. You know, you just take the word of your patient as to what they're doing. It's not something you can measure unless they end up suiciding at the end or self-harm. So I don't think that RCTs are that difficult to do in this area. But I'm not an expert in it, but it seems like there's some overlap there with, you know, things that like, you know, serious brain surgery to cure depression or PTSD or all sorts of things.
Yeah, I think one of the things she was alluding to was that just the physical changes brought on by hormones and and stalled by puberty blockers. It's just hard to keep people blind to what arm of the trial they're in. Right. But otherwise, I think what you're saying makes sense.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to know your thoughts on kind of like there are a lot of these identitarian-based issues, not just in this particular youth gender debate, but also a lot of issues on the other activity. And, you know, I noticed that I tend to believe that, you know, reasoning based on identity politics is not a good idea, right? But I also tend to see that people who agree with me on that also tend to be a certain kind of identity as well. And so I wonder how, yeah, we can look in the room, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, and I just wonder how, you know, whether it's, you know, how we can both expand access to you know, high quality scientific reasoning and also, you know, the ideas that we think are good in society based on science, while also not lowering the bar of, you know, expectations, you know, the bar of entry in terms of like what we require people to, you know, do or how we require people to reason to have these kind of conversations or thoughts.
Sorry, you're saying that just like the risk of becoming cliquish and tribal, you know?
I mean, I guess I'm more concerned about the potential to become more prosperous and more intelligent as a society if we're able to expand our reach in terms of like having more people to the scientific values that we believe are valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is like my go-to answer other than it's complicated is like class. I think a lot of what's going on in like liberal spaces has to do with class and with fashionable ideas about how to repair society. And sometimes those get laundered as like a white person speaking on behalf of the oppressed saying we need to abolish the police, which is not something that most non-white people want to do. I mean, that's just one example I've written about. So yeah, I don't know. Just to the extent we can realize that like what the kinds of people who would show up for a USC, no, UCLA event, whatever the hell school this is, we are not reflective of society. I don't know how to go about that or how to fix it, especially as things get more unequal and how as few, I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit, but it just seems like the whole heterodox academy thing is a class thing. It's like certain ideas are allowed, not because they're popular, but because a subset of people like them a lot. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, please.
I sort of hesitate to say this because it makes me sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist, but
The moon landing was fake.
no. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on the role of money in all of this. Money to be made.
Yeah.
I know that the European countries that have gone to a much more cautious model all have national medical systems.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of money to be made.
I've never really looked into it. I definitely have people who email me and think like the pharmaceutical companies are driving this. I asked one guy about this one. That's journalism. You ask one guy once about a thing, and then you make that your view. And he was someone who's skeptical of youth gender medicine. He was basically just saying like relative to other drugs, the raw number of people isn't that high to make that like a big influence. So I haven't, say again? Yeah, maybe, yeah. To me, the bigger issue, I think there's a genuine conflict of interest when you have youth gender clinicians who have been touting these treatments since 2017, 2018. I don't think they should be on like a big NIH grant studying whether the treatments they've been saying work all along work. I'm sure, I don't know anything about the bureaucratic side of this. I'm sure it's not a sort of actual violation of any rule. I just don't understand how that can be the case. Because you can, you know, I criticized or mentioned folks like Joanna Olson-Kennedy who say, yep, yeah, UCLA, yeah. And something seems off there scientifically. If in 2018 you're saying these treatments work, they're great, and then 5 years later you can publish a study with federal money, turns out these treatments work and are great. I just don't, and in Europe it's like faceless, nerdy bureaucrats running these evidence reviews. I think that's a much better system. So do I think someone like Olson-Kennedy is getting rich just from this? No, but there's clearly some kind of like conflict there that I don't, it surprises me that it isn't talked about more.
All right, one more question?
Yeah.
Great, please.
Do you think there's some underlying issue to some of these peer-reviewed journals that are publishing these studies?
Yeah. I mean, I think, just, yeah, have a good night, everyone. I mean, I think some of them are everywhere. Just like in general, people prefer positive results to null results. They prefer results that will get attention. I also think that in some of these journals, there's that same ideological force that you see in some newsrooms where people want to, for what they see as protect trans kids and protect trans people, which is like, who could be against that in the abstract? But when that means skewing what you do and don't publish, or you know, fiddling around with peer review in certain ways, I think that's a big problem. And I'd be very curious what's going on at like the highest level of these journals. If only there was some profession whose job was to get that sort of information, but we don't have that.
Well, thank you all very much for coming and for
Thank you,
asking
guys.
such great questions. And thank you, Jesse.
Thank you. That's it. Great. Oh, yeah, I'm really happy that I went. Yeah. Oh, wait. You can all still hear me.